coming up next, this is somebody I've known for many, many years. He's always brought such thoughtful presentations, such interesting stuff. He's moved on to a really good beard. He used to have the most amazing mustache. That was just always something that stuck out, like literally, because it was waxed and just like literally stuck out on the sides. But Bermon has
Back
been
in the
doing this
day.
for more than 20 years. Oh yeah. Product strategy, design, development, experience in various industries, including aerospace, automotive, financial services, government, manufacturing, publishing, and retail. At Slalom, Bermon leads initiatives to help organizations go from innovation theater to a disciplined, well-orchestrated, and practical approach to innovation. I cannot wait to see the stuff that you've got to show today, Bermon. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Jason. Let's dig in. That was a great intro. For context on what we're going to do today, this is very much a case study. So I have about a 20-person team on the ground at one of our clients, helping them with a fairly large digital transformation. I'm going to run you through just all of the stuff that we've been doing over the past 6 months or so, and what we're planning on doing going into next year. If in the off chance I pause my audio for a moment, I'm going to take a swig of tea, so I'm not coughing so much. Getting over a little bit of a good old COVID that's reared its head here a few weeks ago. So we're going to focus on this case study. We're going to dig in really on three things: a multi-brand design system. How does that work? A headless CMS. That's an interesting direction that a lot of enterprises are going these days. And then we're specifically using a tool called Gatsby that gives us a static site generator, server-side rendering capability that we're using to build these sites. So let's dig in and we'll talk through this. So end to end, the way that we're going to structure the session for the next 30, 35 minutes or so, we're going to talk about the challenges that this particular client is having, go through the solutions that we've been working on, and then dig in a little bit deeper on multi-brand design systems, working with the headless CMS, talking a little bit about the designer-developer collaboration. We'll wrap it up, go into Q&A. For questions, I'm not able to see the chat in real time, so we'll check those at the end and go through whatever questions that you have. So the challenges. This has been a really interesting client that we worked over the past 6 months or so. Amazing client, really cool industry, and they have a really big vision on what they want to do. So this is the challenge that we're faced with. They're a $1 billion enterprise. They have thousands and thousands of locations spread across North America. But historically, they've outsourced their digital capabilities to third parties. So the team itself, their digital maturity is fairly small, or on the low end of the maturity spectrum. Like I said, they're great people. They're trying to do some cool stuff. They're also hiring a lot to bridge some of their capability gaps with new individuals. So some of the four of the key challenges that we're having with them, or they've experienced, we're trying to help them correct, is just generally their digital maturity is just really low. They've relied on a lot of third parties to build their infrastructure, to build their systems, build their marketing capabilities. And some of what they've implemented is a little bit old. Even net new, it's probably behind where they need to be. At the end of the day, this is impacting in a negative way their customer experience. The company itself is large, right? They're large footprint in North America. They have roughly 15 brands that fall under their family of brands. And because of that, their brands historically have worked in silos. There's a lot of shadow IT involved, meaning that they've gone off, they've brought on their own agencies, their own third-party vendors, their own solution providers to build services and infrastructure for their brands. The challenge with that is that none of them connect with each other. If you were to go to 3 of their brands and have a service performed, you are 3 different people, 3 different customers. They don't know that you're the same person. That means that they can't support you across their ecosystem in the services that they offer. And if you own a car, they can do end-to-end service: oil change, car wash, glass replace, repair, dent repair, paint, etc. That's the space that they live in. The third challenge that they experience is that they tend to do this ready, fire, aim approach in how they send things to market, especially in digital. Um, they're not as customer focused in digital as they are in their physical shops. Their shops have a great experience. Digital, not so much. They don't test and validate a ton. It's very much a shotgun approach. They're just tossing a bunch of stuff out there to see what sticks. Every once in a while, they get lucky. But from an industry standpoint, they are printing money. And because they haven't really had to focus on where they're spending their resources and what they're sending to market, it hasn't been as big of a deal. But we're trying to help them mature their thinking and how they think about that. All of that leads to what we just lovingly call large experience gaps. If we think of this from a service design perspective, where we're marrying together the experience from digital channels to the physical locations, there's a large disconnect within a single brand and definitely across all of their brands. This impacts things like trust with their customers. If they go from one brand to another, it has a negative impact on their conversion rates, and it reduces the revenue that they could potentially gain through their various digital channels. But I like that all of these things exist because as we think about solutions and how we solve these types of problems, these big challenges lead to really big opportunities. Now, because they are so low on their digital maturity scale, it means that even if we improve things by a small margin, the returns can be substantial. And that's an exciting place to be in. So their goals as an enterprise at the end of the day is to increase top of the funnel customer acquisition. That's how they make their money. That's how the business grows. That's how their teams stay gainfully employed. That's how they expand their footprint here in North America. And then they want to be able to enable what they call a single view of the customer. This is sort of like this unicorn from a marketing standpoint. And then as they start to communicate with their consumers, with their customers, they want to be able to write things in one location and then publish anywhere, web, mobile, kiosk, digital signage, right? Because they have physical locations. And the way that they think about measuring success is they're trying to increase same-store sales. They're trying to improve or increase their customer retention. This is through proactive outreach, personalized recommendations, and then upselling, making sure customers are aware that they have other brands and other services they could benefit from. And then that helps them improve their brand penetration. Most customers don't know who the parent company is and what other brands exist in that family of brands. And then from a going to market standpoint, they want to decrease the time that it takes to get new features, new experiences, enhancements to market. So the way that we're trying to help them do that from a technology standpoint is this graph or visual that you see here on the right-hand side. We're going to break this down piece by piece, but this is the direction that we're going, trying to make sure that from an infrastructure standpoint, they have a consistent cloud architecture, and then that they're leveraging the CMS and a design system with a consistent way to support and build and deploy new features and enhancements to all their various brands in a consistent way. So that is been really what we've been focusing on. So really quick, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I want to make sure we all understand when we say JAMStack, what does it actually mean? Now, we're taking a JAMStack approach to the sites. The simplest way is it's essentially JavaScript. We're using JavaScript for pretty much everything. All of the data is being sourced through various APIs and other data sources. We're accessing those right now through GraphQL. And then we're serving, in most cases, static markup. Most of the content that's going live on these sites are marketing content. And it's perfectly fine to send static sites or static content into AWS in our case. But we do have some specific needs where some of the experiences are more transactional, and we need to employ server-side rendering to make sure all that works well. So this is the JAMStack sort of mentality that we've been taking as we've been working through their technical strategy. Old school, things were very, very simple. We would go from browser to server and back and forth. FTP was the way that we would typically update things live in production, right? We didn't have a ton of environments set up then. And we eventually added on a database so we could actually pull data from the database. And then as there was a need to serve content more efficiently, CDNs became a thing. And then we started to do microservices or API services so that we could be smart around how we're consuming data, and the payloads would get smaller and we could consume on sort of like an on-demand or as-needed basis. And then we move into more of the world that we're kind of in today, where things start to split just a little bit, where we're still consuming API services, but we're tacking on a headless content management system. It's essentially a content API, and then they're connecting to various databases. But then those are decoupled from the interface. So if you think of like a WordPress or a Drupal, the editor, admin, publishing interface is tightly coupled to the UI. Now, granted, you can turn WordPress into a headless CMS, but it doesn't work that way by default. So you break those apart. There's typically the APIs, content API, data APIs, and those are getting more loosely coupled to the actual interface or UI that you're publishing or deploying to your production environment that goes through a CDN. So let's break this down just a little bit. So what we have set up for them, they needed a handful of things in place to truly make this work well. They needed a net new cloud infrastructure that goes from CDN all the way to how the CMS and the UI or the static sites integrate with the cloud. They also have their own data lake off to the side that they're actually using GCP or Google Cloud Platform to host all of their internal data. So from a cloud hosting infrastructure, where we're typically agnostic in the way that we do this, we can use Google, we can use AWS, we can use Azure. In this case, they already had some AWS work that they were working on internally. We decided to just expand on that, give them things like a CDN, using Shield as an example for DDoS protection, DNS for routing, something for the firewall, ACM to manage all their security certificates, CloudWatch to do all the infrastructure monitoring that we need. And then because we do have to do some computing on the server using a Lambda server, this integrates with the CMS. We'll walk through that in a second as well. And then a few different options of cloud storage. S3 is one. And because they're trying to start connecting these various brands, having a single sign-on, a way to really manage access to all the various points of data, all the various systems, and then beginning to create an API gateway, centralized API layer. One of their biggest challenges is they have a heavy acquisition model. What that means is as they're expanding their footprint, they're either opening new corporate locations, or they're doing franchises, or they're acquiring smaller companies that might have 20, 30, 40, 50 locations, maybe a couple hundred locations that they bring into the mix of their brand families. What that means is that they all typically have different point of sale systems, different infrastructure, different architecture, and it is almost impossible to manually integrate with all of those different systems through some of these authenticated or logged in experiences, especially where they're transacting or paying through different point of sale systems. So the next big initiative is, in one case, one of their businesses has essentially 11 different point of sale systems. The data that the point of sale systems are processing is roughly the same, but the attributes and the way that it collects the data is different. So the API layer gives us a way to abstract out the commonalities across all of these different systems so that we can plug in a new POS. But from a UI standpoint, across the different digital channels, we're just hitting the same endpoints, and they can plug in whatever behind the scenes systems they need to make that work. So we're trying to set this up in a way that it scales across each of their brands, so that it's consistent, relatively easy to maintain, and we can scale it to be more of an enterprise solution. The next area, and this is where a chunk of my team is spending most of their time, is around the headless CMS. The big difference, we'll get into this in a moment, is the way that a headless CMS works versus a traditional CMS. Drupal, WordPress, even the larger enterprise content management systems like a Sitecore or Adobe Experience Manager or SharePoint in some cases. Essentially, it gives us a way to create, they call them spaces in the CMS. Those spaces house content models, and that's where the APIs typically come from. Every brand essentially is allocated their own space with their own content models and own content. Some of that's just for practicality purposes, so we can manage access to who can do what within a given brand. And then the second thing is around just general repository management. How are we doing that? Essentially, there's a repository for the design system. The design system is, obviously centralized, and it supports multiple brands. And then every brand site has their own repo that's set up in Gatsby. That's the generator that we're using with React sort of behind the scenes. And then we're trying to leverage GitHub Actions as much as we can to drive some of the DevOps work that needs to happen. Those all connect directly to the API gateway that either connects us with various third-party services or their data lake to generate these experiences. So that's been an adventure to work out with them. So multi-brand design systems, that's something that we've started to hear a lot more of with some of the larger brands. That this brand isn't terribly unique in that sense. They just have a lot of brands that sit under their umbrella. And what we wanted to provide to them is a level of efficiency and scalability, because all of their brand sites have very similar experiences. That they're essentially trying to market services and provide brand content, blogs, etc., contact forms. And at a component level, they probably share 95% of the various UI components across every single brand. There are a few brands that have some edge cases that require a unique component, but by and large, they have a large percentage where they share the same stuff. So the way that I think about design systems and how we set this up is we want to help manage design at scale and reduce duplicated efforts. Our team is still relatively small compared to the level of work that needs to be done. Their internal team is just getting started. They only have 2 UI engineers, and we're still working to hire DevOps and cloud engineers that can manage some of the infrastructure work. They just hired their first UX designer. So from a context standpoint, they're not ready to maintain and support a design system longer term. So we're taking that into account, right? We're consultants, and eventually we go away. So we have to set them up in a way that they can manage and govern this thing once we go away so it doesn't die. So some of the basic guiding principles that we think of when we're standing up a design system is, to my earlier point, you have to have the people, processes, and governance in place to make sure that this can live as essentially a product that has to be maintained and updated. Basic guiding principles, points of view, best practices. Some of this we use to onboard all their new hires so that we're all speaking the same language. We understand why this design system exists and how we need to maintain it together. Everything is going into code, right? We're using Figma to get the initial mock-ups or comps ready to go. And then once things go into the design system is the single source of truth for the UI, the interactions, and where these types of components should be used, what context is useful. And then we're currently in the process, especially as they hire more people, figuring out what tools, assets, and resources are needed collectively that can benefit from the design system. And because we're supporting 15 brands, every brand is unique. Every brand has a unique tone and voice. So as we leverage these components across these different brands, all of those things have to be captured. From a structural standpoint in the design system, there are core elements that we have to build. Just the basic building blocks that you would put in there. Elements are sort of like the next level of detail, and then the team spends a lot of their time at the component level, and then they turn those components into larger templates, and then they use those templates to build pages. So basic design system flow on how that works. And then the benefits and how we've really tried to sell this internally to the client is helping them get to market faster. That's been one of their biggest pain points. It takes them 6 to 8 weeks on a good day to get a new feature out, even if it's very basic content updates. So we want to reduce that down to a couple of days, maybe a week at most, depending on the complexity, and then also drive consistency, even within their own brand sites. Buttons and labels and just general organization of the content is very inconsistent. In some cases, you jump from page to page and it feels like a totally different site. So we're really trying to drive consistency and quality for them. And money doesn't grow on trees. Like, even though their business is doing really, really well, there are efficiency gains by leveraging a design system, especially at this scale, for so many different brands. We're also trying to drive better collaboration because things have been siloed for so long. They don't quite have the culture to collaborate at the level that they need to. So we're pushing stakeholders, we're educating stakeholders, we're educating their teams, and we're trying to drive better collaboration behaviors as they work on features, develop their roadmaps, and determine what really needs to happen to support their customers. And then at the end of the day, operational efficiency, operational excellence is what we strive for. Creating these reusable systems that can scale, that are flexible. So when it comes to design systems, it's good to start somewhere. Then try and scale. We're essentially right now between a pattern library and a true design system. They're not quite ready for the full design system because they can't support it. They don't have the people in-house yet. But we started there, and we're trying to slowly improve their maturity as they onboard new people to the team, and as those individuals get more comfortable using the design system as sort of a methodology on how they approach designing pages, designing features. It enforces conversations that have to happen around if they're doing something net new, what percentage of that experience can leverage existing stuff? Or do we have to create something net new that goes into the design system? A lot of really rich conversations around that, so the design system doesn't become unwieldy with one-off components. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about Headless CMS. I've been using Headless CMS for quite a number of years. I actually talked about using Strappy and Vue years ago at this same event. Strappy is my go-to for personal projects, prototyping, etc. Very similar approach on how they all work. In this case, we're going with Contentful. This client specifically needed a support model with enterprise-level SLAs, and Contentful really fit the bill on that one. Traditional content management systems were essentially designed to build web pages. I used Joomla and Drupal. Those were my go-tos back in the day. Used WordPress every once in a while. I've done a lot of Sitecore, a lot of experience manager projects over the last couple of decades. And at their time, they worked really, really well. Our mental model on how we're managing content has shifted. Headless content management systems were built specifically to decouple the admin experience and the content from the pages or the channels that they provide content to. So it's much more of an omni-channel approach with the headless content management systems. This client particularly, they have websites, they have mobile apps, they have kiosks in their shops, and they also have digital signage in their shops. They need a content management solution that can service content to all of those locations. that are either global marketing messaging, and that can go out to a few thousand locations at sort of the push of a button, or hyper-localized messaging that can be managed from a shop owner or from the core marketing team. So the basic building blocks are really important with the Headless CMS. We have our content models. And we're going to dig into this one specifically because it's the one that will get you in the most trouble if it's not done well. This is the schema, the architecture of the content that goes into the CMS. Typically, it's defined per space or per environment, and it's comprised of various content types. The content types have the content definitions. This is the blueprint or the cookie cutter that's used for the various entries in the CMS. This is essentially the field level attributes that a content editor would put in or type into in the CMS. You have the entry itself. So if I'm an editor or a content reviewer, this is the admin view that I see. So all of that rolls up to being able to edit content. And then Contentful specifically has a way to manage assets, images, videos, PDFs, other types of binary files. It's not as complex or feature rich as a DAM, as an example, but it's good enough for most basic content sites. If you do need to integrate with a DAM or one of those types of systems, you can integrate. It's not that big of a deal. Some of the most important features, and one of the reasons that we went with Contentful, is that the authoring and editing experience is relatively simple. It's really dependent on how cleanly you define and structure your content models. We want a simple UI. These folks are typically not very technical, but they can go in and they can fill out forms. Versioning is another important thing, so they can roll back content when they need to. Simple asset management, right? It gives them the ability to do some of that stuff. But two of the things that are important for them are authoring workflows. They're not terribly complex, but they need some basic workflows where marketers can come in, they can edit content, and then other individuals can approve content, and then somebody or somebody's can mash the publish button and make sure that things go live. Just basic checks and balances. And then when it comes to publishing content, one of the interesting things that I like about Contentful that Strappy didn't have is the ability to plan releases and schedule or reschedule publication of content. So they can build out a content calendar. They can decide when promotions go live, when they come offline, when new content updates happen. And that's been really beneficial for them. To compare, a page for everything versus modular content. If we were designing a home page in WordPress or Drupal or another content management system, the image on the left is typically what we would do. We would design the home page and make sure all the fields were in place. If you do something in a Headless CMS, you're essentially figuring out what the content components need to be, and you're designing or defining content models to support the content. So a homepage may have between 8 and 15 different content models. And some of those content models may be nested where you're consuming content models from other areas or that are fit for a different purpose. An example of that is a model that you see here. This is just a really, really basic content modeling structure where you have a page as a content model, but that page is also referencing other content modules, one that focuses on metadata, essentially SEO content, title descriptions, no index, no follow type stuff. That typically lives in its own separate content model. You have global attributes that you might want to pull into a page, like page headers, footers, preferred language. And then typically, even though you can manage assets in the CMS, it's best practice to create an actual asset content model. That gives you a lot more flexibility around the asset that you're embedding in another model. If you expand that out a little bit more, this is an example of a blog content model. You can see the various attributes that are part of the model. It's also consuming essentially another metadata SEO type content model, and it's still consuming a similar asset content model. This is a really common approach as you're building out content models and content types in a headless CMS. And then as things get more and more complex, this is essentially the content modeling necessary for a large help center. There's a lot of shared content models, and this is all I could fit on the page and still have it be mostly legible. This becomes a challenge. It becomes very much a content strategy and an information architecture challenge. I'm actually supporting another another team. We have a client that had something built in Contentful, but it was built by developers, and developers are amazing people. Used to be one myself, but the way that they think about things is a little bit different from somebody that has an information architecture background. What's ended up happening is they have too many content models. They're not built to be scalable, and then they've done too many levels of nesting. So from an editor standpoint, if I'm a content editor, it is a miserable experience to go into the CMS and try and make really basic changes. So we're coming in to help them rehash their content models and their overall structure to streamline what's there. What you see on the screen here essentially needs to be cut in half. They don't need this level of complexity. So, big lessons learned on headless CMSs and just content management systems in general is that there are downstream impacts to every decision that you make on how you model the content, how you nest content, and how you structure the relationship between content models and pages. One of the things that we encourage our teams to do constantly is once you build out content models, and once you get something set up so somebody can go in and edit that page or that model in the CMS, go try and do it yourself and see how easy it is. How many clicks do you have to go through to update the content? If you're nesting things 4 or 5 levels down, you're probably a couple levels too deep. So there's a lot of work there to just drive the collaboration. The second thing is depending on how they structure the content models also depends on how easy it is for developers to ingest that content from the API. So there's a nice back and forth or collaboration that needs to happen between the content strategists that are doing the modeling, the business folks or marketing folks that are having to edit and change content, and the engineers to have to implement. It's got to work for everybody. So there's some orchestration that needs to be that needs to exist to make sure that everything is streamlined. All right. So that leads us to a bit of the designer-developer collaboration. This is a struggle that happens pretty often, where teams are siloed, and we're trying to counterbalance this now. Essentially, what we have on our existing team, we have a team working on SEO. We have a team working on Google Analytics. We have a team working on marketing integrations with Salesforce. And then we have more like technical design engineering pods that are assigned per brand. We're doing 4 brands of the 15 right now that will launch and deploy by the end of the year. One's supposed to launch here in the next couple of weeks. As the teams get larger and they start to support more and more brands, that the number of communication points between the different teams and different people becomes exponentially larger, becomes harder to manage. And keeping the teams in sync on, because they're all using the same design system, keeping the teams in sync around net new components. Does it really have to exist? Did a designer design something that has a 95% overlap with the designs and experience for 2 or 3 of the other brands? Conversations around how do we bring those designs into alignment so they match much more closely? Is there a business reason with quantifiable value that would dictate the creation of a net new component with a large percentage overlap with something that already exists. If not, then I'm normally the bad guy and have to go, hey, we need to remove that, adjust this, and this component has to align with the other 3 sites that are already in progress. Unless they can quantify a specific reason, we've got to drive that alignment. But that requires somebody that's looking at everything and making sure that happens. The second challenge, or another challenge that we see a lot, is this concept of a handoff. In some cases, a lot of teams still struggle with sort of like a waterfall approach. The business is doing requirements definition. The product folks are creating the designs, the mock-ups, et cetera, incorporating the content. That's getting passed off to the developers. They engineer the thing, and then it gets implemented somewhere down the line. The challenge with that type of approach is you lose meaning every step. I used to work at a large financial institution. I was one of the UI engineers at the time, and I was probably 7 levels down of that communication tree. The business did their thing. Content had to write the content. They would give that off to the wireframers. They would do their wireframing. They would hand that off to design. They would make it look nice. And then they would eventually hand that off to the engineers, and we would make it. And essentially, we're probably, from the initial idea to us starting implementation, is probably a 6-week gap, 6 to 8 week gap. And by the time we start engineering something, changes are already coming down the top of the waterfall. So it was very common for us where designs are changing or the content doc is changed, and we've implemented something that is no longer valid. Biggest challenge there is it was a handoff. It was here, you take this thing and do whatever your job is. My personal preference is like that doesn't happen. There has to be what I like to call the trifecta. You need the business folks, the marketing folks, the experience folks, and the technology folks in the same room talking about this stuff through the entirety of the cycle. So you don't end up with this handoff scenario where things are lost in translation, and you lose meaning and context after every cycle. Ideally, we're reviewing the work as we need to. So what we're pushing on our teams is they've got to collaborate and communicate more often during the process. Before design is approved, the engineers need to be involved. Before content is approved, or the business is making certain decisions on what they want and what those requirements are, design and engineering need to be involved in those conversations, so that we're all working in lockstep and we're not creating one-offs because one brand wants something, another brand wants something that's mostly the same but just marginally different, so that we can connect everything. The second thing is the interactions. One of the things that I've noticed specifically with newer designers, even newer engineers, is we assume that when we design a mock-up, people can infer what the interactions are supposed to be in the interface, right? We're not doing clickable prototypes for every single interaction on every single page. What ends up happening is when the engineers get the mock-up or get the Figma file, there's a lack of documentation on when you click here, that thing is supposed to happen. And sometimes the designers miss something. So we're really trying to enforce the behavior of making sure that we're talking through those interactions. Is it technically feasible? Should the interaction actually be that way? A recent example, and I was going back and forth with the team the other day, we have a multi-step sort of complex transactional flow with a bunch of forms. And there was one part in the flow that would trigger a completely different UI with tabs. That was probably unnecessary. There's a lot of, it's not hard to do technically, but it's unnecessary to do because it doesn't have any positive impact to the interface. Another example was we're doing make, model, year type things as part of one of the forms. And the designers wanted to have the field show up when you filled out the previous field. So the fields would sort of magically appear in the interface. Sounds cool, not very practical, not a very good user experience in some cases. Because as a user, I should know what fields I need to fill out. You shouldn't keep tossing them at me. So conversations like that to make sure that we're clarifying the interactions, are the interactions correct? Are we deciding to do interactions that are more complex than they need to? The next thing that really helps with collab and communication between the teams is requirements. Requirements is like this weird space where we have requirements. Some designers, some engineers assume those requirements are law. We have to do those things. A lot of the requirements are poorly written in a lot of companies, and they're based on a lot of assumptions. The more complex the requirement is, the more assumptions that we're making, and the more assumptions that we make, the larger risk we incur of building something that may not be exactly the right thing. So another thing that I encourage our teams to do, and I coach our teams to do, is that as we're gathering requirements, we also need to be noting what assumptions that we're making and what's there. And our goal, specifically on a design and product lens and from a technology lens, can we validate those assumptions before we start building something, so that we reduce our risk, to make sure that when we develop something, it's the right thing and we can go to market with less technical debt, less risk. And then the design system, like most things in design, it becomes this thing that we think we all have to do. Everything has to have a design system, and it probably doesn't. There are probably some projects that don't need a design system. It's a one-off, or it's small, or it has a lifespan. In the case of this particular client, absolutely, that they would benefit greatly from a design system, because their current world is re-engineering everything 15 times, and that's extremely expensive. We can engineer the foundation once, and then replicate it for the other brands. That there are large cost savings, time savings on maintenance, going to market, etc., to leverage a design system. But everything doesn't have to have a design system. Okay. So wrapping up, it's been an interesting project. Getting the teams on board, understanding how this works together, orchestrating all of this different stuff with a client. It's large, complex. We're trying to use latest and greatest tools that are out there, so that the client's starting at a good spot, and 2, 3, 4 years down the road, their level of maturity is continuing to increase, and their infrastructure isn't so dated that they can't continue to maintain and scale. If you want to talk about it, hit me up. I do office hours every Friday morning from 7 to 9 a.m. And you can hit up my Calendly. I'll typically spend a lot of time talking about things like this. I'll do career coaching, review resumes, do interview prep for folks that are looking for jobs. If I know folks' places, I'm glad to connect people as well. And I don't really tweet much these days, but I'm still there, sort of hovering. So Bermon Painter online. So what questions and comments do you have?
Hey, Bermon, that was awesome. Thank you. Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of time left, because we've got a short break and another long talk before we wrap the day. But one thing that was really kind of burning a hole in my brain, and Kyle actually articulated it really well, when you are using a headless CMS and some sort of front end, how have you tackled the idea of preview for admins? Because I know that's always something that we struggle with as well. What's been the solution there?
So Contentful has a preview API, and you can tie that into AWS. Essentially, with Contentful, it'll spin up a preview page. This is where the Lambda server comes into play, so that I can see what I've done. Gatsby specifically, if you're using Gatsby Cloud, it'll generate those for you automatically. If you're using something like Next, you can use essentially any cloud service, but it depends on the headless CMS that you're using. Strappy, as an example, I don't believe they may have added it, but I don't think they have a preview API to actually generate those previews. You could probably force it to do something like that. Preview API, choose a CMS with a preview API is probably the easiest answer. And then whatever cloud infrastructure you're using will typically support it. There is a caveat with Gatsby, and this is more of a gap with Amplify, is when it comes to things like server-side rendering, Gatsby can do it. Amplify doesn't support it. It'll only support it through Next. That was a fun lessons learned as we realized that one of the previous vendors was using Amplify, and none of our SSR stuff was actually rendering. So that was an adventure. So that, yeah, preview API, Headless CMS, it supports it.
Great. Thank you so much. I've got a million questions to follow up with you at some point after this about how you manage the differentiation and branding and all of that stuff in your design system. But I have a feeling if we start going down that rabbit hole, we'll be here for another few hours. Bermon, thank you so much. I'm so glad you're feeling better. Thank you so much for taking the time to present with us. And I can't wait till we get to hang out again in person.